Now we're going to start talking about a very important lesson. This is probably the most important lesson on this video, and this is changing your exposure controls. So we're going to talk about the mode dial, and then we're going to talk about how to change our brightness settings in each of the modes. So you'll notice that as we change the mode dial, we get these different letters and symbols in the upper left-hand corner. There's the dummy mode, the A mode. We have this FV mode that I'll talk about after manual mode. There's the P mode, which I've told you to shoot on if you're a brand new photographer. But the easiest way for me to teach you about exposure control is an AV mode, which stands for aperture value or aperture priority. Aperture priority mode is the mode that I want you to learn your camera on as soon as possible. As soon as you're willing to take the jump, the risk, shoot on aperture priority mode because you will use it for the rest of your career. I consider it a professional mode that I've used countless times on wedding shoots, sports shoots. I use it all the time. Aperture priority mode is also the easiest way for me to explain how the camera measures light, as well as how we change the settings and when we change the settings. Now, you remember when we were talking about the buttons, I like to call this guy here the primary selector wheel, primary one with the index finger. Your index finger is resting on the primary selector. Why do I call it the primary selector? Each of these modes will behave differently depending on which setting they're on. In an aperture priority mode, it means that we change the aperture, right? Primary setting. So my index finger is changing the aperture as I rotate this back and forth. And this is something you should do. Now, something else you'll notice is we're not seeing the shutter speed. Where did the shutter speed go? Aperture priority mode works by allowing us to tell the camera the aperture we want, and the camera will adjust the shutter speed. So we adjust the aperture, and the camera does the rest of the work for us. Great. So what do these F numbers mean? These are inverse in terms of how they're proportionate. Smaller numbers mean wider lens openings. Larger numbers mean smaller openings. So F22 means our lens has a very small opening, and F4 means our lens has a much wider opening. Which one do you think lets in more light? A wide opening or a teeny tiny small opening? That's right, wide openings let in more light. So depending on the lens you have, this lens is maxed out at F4. This is a ratio between the maximum opening of the lens and how far away it is from the lens. That's really where we get F numbers from. So if you get a lens that is a 2.8 or a 1.8, that means it has a really wide opening and it's letting in a huge amount of light. As we change the setting to a larger number, that opening will get smaller and smaller, teeny and tiny. It's going to let in less and less amount of light. So you should be asking yourself a question. If Michael is changing the F setting, how come this isn't changing? How come the brightness isn't changing? I mean, if he's letting in more light, this should be brighter than this, right? And that is what aperture priority does, is the camera is making adjustments to the shutter speed as we are adjusting the aperture. That's how this is working. And I can prove it to you, is that if you tap the shutter button, now we can see the shutter speed. It tries to hide it from us to make our lives easier. But as I adjust the aperture, you can see the shutter speed also adjusting and compensating. When I have a wider opening, it's using a faster shutter speed. When I have a smaller opening, it has a much longer shutter speed. It's letting in a lot more light than it did at f4. And that is how aperture priority works. We select the aperture, the camera selects the shutter speed. This is the heart of the matter when you're shooting an aperture priority. We have some control, the camera's going to do the rest. And if you can walk away from this discussion today just with this, you are way ahead of where I was probably about a year into my photography career, is understanding aperture priority mode. So that's how it works. Now I want to demonstrate something to take this even a step further. I want you to take your hand, wherever you are, and slowly bring it in front of the camera. We're going to tap the shutter button as we're doing this. Watch what happens. See, it's at 250, we're at 1/250th of a second right now. It's a fraction of a second, right? Now watch what happens. Here comes the hand. Look what's happening to the shutter speed. I'm not changing the aperture now. I'm gonna cover this up. And now it's giving us shutter speeds in the seconds. And if I move my hand away, well, now it jumps back to 1/250th of a second. And you could play this game all day long, and you should experiment with this. And this is something that most beginning and intermediate photographers don't understand, is that the camera is constantly measuring how much light is coming into the lens, whether you're changing the aperture or if you're changing the environment. And if I walk out on a bright sunny day and there's all this light coming in, the camera is going to use an even faster shutter speed. And that's the heart of the matter with aperture priority mode, is that we select the aperture and the camera will select a shutter speed depending on the brightness of the conditions that we're shooting in. I get questions all the time from photographers. Hey, I'm at a wide aperture and I can't get a fast shutter speed. And what's going on? I say, go outside. You'll get a faster shot. They're shooting in their living room and it's dark. Now, the key on this, and there's something to keep an eye on, is that when you are shooting with aperture priority mode, you do have to sneak a peek over here at your shutter speed to make sure it's fast enough. If you're handheld shooting, let's say portraits, for example, you want to make sure that you have at least 1/60th of a second. Because when we get into these longer shutter speeds that are longer than 1/60th, like 1/30th or 20th, now we're getting very long shutter speeds, is that as you hold the camera, there's a little bit of shake. It doesn't seem like it, but if you move a little teeny bit with a long shutter speed, your picture is going to be blurry. And it can be very frustrating when you don't understand, hey, I had it on aperture priority. So you always want to keep an eye out on your shutter speed and make sure it's 1/60th of a second or even faster than that. If you don't do that, you have a lot of blurry pictures. Now, there's actually a rule, the reciprocal rule, about your lens. So as you get a more telephoto lens, you want this to be even faster. And that reciprocal rule is you want to inverse your focal length. So if I'm shooting with a 100 millimeter lens, the idea is I want to shoot at 1/100th of a second minimum. If I'm shooting with a 500 millimeter lens, then I would want this to say at least 1/500th of a second. And there's different ways to tweak this. Why? Because as you get more and more telephoto, any movement will be magnified. So another question that I'm sure many of you will probably have, Michael, that's great. How do we change the brightness? Okay, there's a long answer to this and there's a short answer to this. I'm going to give you both. The short answer is that when you are ready to change the brightness, you are going to rotate the secondary control wheel here. And you'll notice on the bottom, we have these numbers, -3, -2, -1. We have a 0 for diamond home plate, +1, 2, and 3. When you move this to the right, oh, you see it's not working right now? This is also confusing. Tap your shutter button, right? How would you know that? And then rotate the dial, you'll notice the screen will start to get brighter. I'm going to move it to that 1. So let's take a picture here. This is an even exposure. Now I'm going to rotate it to 1. Now I'm going to rotate it to 2. And now I'm going to rotate it to 3. And if we play those back, we could see there's a couple other cool things, is that if you can pinch out, you can see that we have different exposures: even, +1, +2, +3. So the short answer is in the P mode, the TV mode, and the AV mode, that's how we change the brightness. If you're not happy with the brightness, you can change this right here. What if you wanted to make it darker? And I'm tapping on the shutter button to jump back in. We just go in the opposite direction. I'm going to change it from here now, where I can touch directly on the exposure compensation bar. Let's go to -1. Let's go to -3. It's much darker. We can play those back. That is the short answer of how we can change the exposure. Exposure means brightness. So I'm going to send this back to 0. Now let me explain to you what's going on when we use exposure compensation and what these numbers mean on the bottom. Each of these numbers refers to as one stop of light. One stop of light basically means it's twice the amount of light that we had before. So one stop would be twice, 2 stops would be 4 times, 3 stops would be 8 times the amount of light. And I can even prove this to you. And I want to show this how this works. I'm going to tap the shutter button so we can see our shutter speed. Here we are. 1/250th of a second. I'm going to rotate to come up to +1. We have a shutter speed that is twice as long. People will be like, what? I'm confused. So this is a fraction. 1/250th of a second plus 1/250th of a second is 2/250ths of a second, right? So if we simplify that, that's really 1/125th of a second. So this is proving how exposure compensation works. The camera is making adjustments to the brightness by tweaking the shutter speed. It's letting more light in. We're giving a special instruction to the camera, hey, I want it twice as bright at one stop. So this is neutral. This is twice as bright. There's twice as much light coming in. And we can do it again. 1/60th is about twice as long as 1/125th. Now, if you're paying attention, I want you to take a guess what you think this number 3 will be, +3. What is twice as long as 1/60th? 1/60th plus 1/60th is 2/60ths. If we simplify that, it's 1/30th. Let's see if it's right. And it is. That's what's happening with exposure compensation. I remember it took me about 1.5 years on my own to figure this out. Because we didn't have YouTube back then. I remember I was shooting, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, right? Now, if we wanted to go one stop in the other direction, we can. So let's rotate that and see what happens. 1/500th of a second is half the amount of shutter speed. It's twice as fast as 1/250th, right? And we can continue to go. It'd be about 1/1000. Sometimes it's not perfectly accurate, and then about 1/2000th, right? Now, the thing about this little bracket here is that these are actually in third stop increments, is that you can adjust it by third stops, and it's going to make the adjustment to the shutter speed. So that is how aperture priority works. We covered a lot of information about it. It is a great mode to use. I always tell the story of when I was a wedding photographer, I would shoot on aperture priority. Why? Because you'll be inside of a dark church, and here come the bride and groom, and now they're walking out into the lobby, and now they're outdoors. Those are 3 different conditions of light, and you're walking, you don't want to trip. You also need to capture the moment. So it's just one less thing for you to worry about as a photographer. As a sports shooter, I also almost always use aperture priority. Some people don't. It's just a matter of preference and taste. But aperture priority should be your home base. So now what I want to do is talk about, I'm going to change my, I'm going to change a setting here before we go over. Let's talk about time value, which is really shutter speed priority. So in shutter priority, a lot of beginners like it because we can dial in our shutter speed directly. If you remember, we changed the aperture with our primary selector, numero uno. In time value mode or shutter priority mode, the primary selector changes the shutter speed. And this is why I like to call it the primary selector, is The primary selector changes the most important setting depending on the mode that we're in. So it's different depending on the modes, right? And it's the opposite of aperture priority, is that as I change the shutter speed, I'm going to tap the shutter button so we can see this, the camera is changing the aperture. If we use a longer shutter speed, we're letting in more light. With shutter speed, the camera is making the aperture smaller and smaller as we let in more and more light to compensate for it, right? So if you are shooting a sporting event, I really believe it's around, you really need about 1/500th of a second. You can see the camera's not happy. This is how the camera is complaining. It's flashing its aperture number at us. It's like, we have a problem. And the problem is that with this shutter speed, we can't really see anything. It's just too dark. The camera is telling you, I'm not happy, but I'm going to do what you're telling me. And it's trying to give you a warning. So if you're shooting, you know, grown adults sprinting at a track or maybe football, it's going to be even a faster shutter speed, maybe 1/1000, maybe 1/2000. And we have a really tight pixel density in our sensor. We may need to use even a faster shutter speed. But let's come back to this 1/500th of a second example. And let me ask you, if you were in this situation, what would you do? We have our minimum shutter speed requirement. If we don't have it, they are going to be blurry. The camera cannot open up its aperture any further. What is the correct step? Now, if you said adjust your ISO, you are absolutely correct. In this case, this is the perfect time to start bumping your ISO up. We just don't have enough light for what we're trying to do. So we might have to shoot at 3200, maybe even more. Let's say 3200. Camera has stopped flashing at us. It's little 4.0, right? Camera is satisfied to a degree, and we could shoot this event, whether it's basketball or whatever, at 1/500th of a second. Everything's cool. So that is a really good tip to know. In some cases, we may even need to go even faster, right? And then again, we would have to bump this up even more to satisfy it, understanding that there's this risk that we would get the grain as we increase our ISO. Now, you can also do this same bumping up of the ISO in aperture priority. So I'm switching back to aperture priority. In the case that you would do it here, I'm going to turn it down a little bit, is if I was shooting a sport, let's say at f4, and I don't have the shutter speed that I want, let's say I want it 1/500, I could turn it up and just sneak a peek over here, and I would know, okay, hey, now it's fast enough. So that's a different way to do it in aperture priority. So that is the difference between the two modes, is that we can change either the aperture or the shutter speed, depending on the mode, and we could sneak a peek when we tap the shutter button, take a look, tweak it with our ISO. The truth of the matter is I don't really use shutter priority mode, and I don't really recommend it, although it is good for learning in cases like this when you're first getting started. Let's talk about the program mode. You'll notice as soon as I turn to the P mode, program mode, is that we don't see either the shutter speed or the aperture. And when I rotate the primary selector wheel, nothing happens. So in this case, I tap the shutter button, and you can see that I can now change the shutter speed. There's no indicator control for the aperture. So in this case, we're basically selecting the shutter speed, and the camera is selecting the aperture just like it did in shutter priority mode. And now we also still have our exposure compensation control. But what program mode really does is it creates combinations that work in certain situations. The best case scenario, I believe, for program mode is what we talked about earlier. If you're just getting started, but for Canon cameras, the program mode is also the handheld flash mode. So if you're getting into strobes, speed lights, and you put a speed light on top of here, program mode is a good way to start. And I know professional photographers who shoot in program mode for speed lights, but I don't like it as much because we don't get as much control. And I prefer aperture priority mode and manual. Speaking of manual, let's take a look at manual mode. In manual mode, you will notice as soon as I turn here, it's overexposed because my ISO is so high. And we can also change ISO by pressing the ISO button on top of the camera, touching and dragging. There's multiple ways to change your ISO. It's really nice. You'll notice in manual mode, M, that we have controls for both the shutter speed and the aperture. The camera doesn't make any adjustments for us in manual mode. We have to dial everything in. I can change the shutter speed with my primary selector. I can change the aperture with the secondary selector. And I can also change my ISO in any of the ways that I demonstrated. I use manual mode mostly when I have more time. So if I'm shooting in a studio setting, for example, if I'm shooting with strobes, if there's no pressure or rush, and I have time to correct things and it's not an action shot, I shoot almost exclusively in manual. If it's a timing thing or a sports or a motion thing, I'm almost always in aperture priority. And you will notice here also that we don't really have a way to change exposure compensation with our wheels. It's not available. So exposure compensation doesn't really work in manual mode, right? But there is something interesting about this little bar down here is that it becomes sort of like an exposure indicator, how bright or how dark something is. So we get this tick mark here, right? So if I go with something brighter, you can see that it's moving over. So it really becomes sort of like a light meter. And again, for some people, manual's even easier because they just dial the settings in, they see the exposure that they get, and they just shoot. Now, having said all of this, I want to take the opportunity to talk about auto ISO. For most of these lessons, I have dialed in a specific ISO number, but there is a setting in here called auto, where this is where our ISO is. Auto ISO gives the camera permission to control the ISO settings, meaning the camera is going to change the ISO depending on your lighting conditions, and it can change it rapidly, even from shot to shot within a fraction of a second. Now, I usually do not use this, but there are certain times and places that it will be a valuable thing to know. Let's say you're shooting MMA fighting, it's indoors, there's strobe lights, sometimes they're bright, sometimes they're dark, and it's constantly changing. And we know that we want a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, right? We also know that we want to use an aperture of f4, but sometimes the lights are bright and dark, and we just don't have time to change the settings of our camera. This would be a good time to use auto ISO because now the camera will have the permission to increase or decrease the ISO depending on the real time in the moment exposure settings of the event. How many lights are on, how many lights are off. If it's rapidly changing, that would probably be the way to do it. Otherwise, I'm dialing this in precisely. I'm sure there's a few other reasons. So we've talked about aperture priority, shutter priority, program mode. We've talked about manual mode. I've covered a little bit about the dummy mode. It turns it in your camera into a point and shoot, basically. But we also have this other mode here called FV mode. FV mode, or flexible priority, is something that Canon has invented. I've only seen it on Canon cameras. And it basically allows users to determine which of the three settings, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, will be the automatic mode. So it starts off in auto on all three. And let's say you just knew that you wanted, to use a fast shutter speed, let's say 1/500th of a second for sports. And that's all you knew. Well, now it has your aperture at auto and your ISO at auto. We could even tweak it further and say, okay, we wanted this ISO. So the flexible priority allows us to determine, to specifically tell the camera which options we want it to control and which ones we do not. It's very similar to each of those four modes we just demonstrated, but this can be a little bit more intuitive if you're first getting started. And that's basically the idea of it. Something you'll notice on this is that as I rotate my secondary control wheel, I can determine what is being changed with the primary selector. So depending on how you want to operate this, get this back onto auto. So that's the idea of it, is it gives us some flexibility to determine what the camera is going to manage, what we will manage, as well as what our primary selector wheel will manage. The bulb mode is the letter B. And when you have the bulb mode, essentially what it means is that you can do much longer exposures by pushing the shutter button down. Here's the first release. And you can see that we get this timer in the bottom right-hand corner. And then when I release my finger, the exposure ends. So that's what the bulb mode does. And in certain situations, you can take very long exposures, certain types of astrophotography, you'd want to use bulb mode. Uh, and then we start getting into problems with how the camera is shaking, right? Because there's, if you're pushing the camera or whatever, it's a problem. A couple other modes that we have on the mode dial is we have this scene feature. And the idea of this is to try to make it easier for beginning photographers to, basically select a situation that they're in and turn it over to the camera, let the camera do it. For the most part, I don't really mess with these because all of these can be managed more or less using the other modes that I've shown you. And it really is kind of turning your camera into a point and shoot. Now, there are a couple exceptions like the HDR mode, handheld night scene. Some of these, silent shutter, it just makes it easier to get to those settings. If you were in let's say a museum and there's no shutter noises, we could select this completely silent, right? You'll notice this banding I'll talk about in just a second. So that is really what the scene modes are for. And we can come in, change them here on the bottom, kids, panning, close up. Some of them are kind of fun, just depending on what you're doing. But for the most part, this isn't really a serious tool because you can access these in these techniques in other means. So I don't really use them. When we come in to these different effects, some of them, again, are kind of interesting, like the HDR modes are kind of fun. There's a miniature effect that creates almost like a tilt shift lens to make, certain things look teeny tiny. Toy camera, again, I don't see these as professional tools, so I never use them, but they are fun to play around with if you ever, if you get bored and you just want to see what they do. But that's what they are. You'll also notice that we have these different settings, C1, C2, and C3. And real quick, the way those work is those are our custom mode settings. We can set up our camera to be in a specific mode, whatever we like. Let's say we're doing portrait shooting and we like to shoot at f4 and we like to have certain picture styles, or maybe we like AI servo and we want to have a specific white balance. We would just come in, we would set all this up exactly the way we like it. And then at that point, we would come into the menu and we would go to our custom shooting mode 1 through 3, register the settings, and we would tell the camera to remember the settings at the C1 position. So if you do different kinds of shooting, whether you're a portrait photographer and a sports shooter, you don't want to have to readjust your settings every time, you would set up custom settings. Scuba diving is another one. If you have a housing, you would have very specific settings, and then you don't have to tweak the settings. You just rotate this to the C1 dial when you are ready to shoot. Notice the white balance is off. That is how those custom mode settings work. Now, something else that you saw just recently, I'm going to demonstrate this. Let me turn this back to auto white balance, is that you saw some banding when I took this picture, this one, when it was on the electronic shutter mode. So I am shooting with LED lights, and LED lights actually flicker. And I have a video as to why they flicker on my YouTube channel. And what's happening is there's a missynchronization between the scan of the image and how often the lights are flickering. You also see this in a video mode. So let me make this happen. I'm going to use a fast shutter speed, maybe something like that. There it is. There is the artifact. I can't tell you how many times I get emails and questions from, oh my gosh, my camera is broken. It's doing this weird line thing. And this again has to do with LED lights. The way this is being scanned in the flickering lighting condition is creating these banding effects. So for video, the way you resolve this is you use a shutter speed of about 125th of a second or longer. You're not going to see it here. The moment you go over that is when you start to see it. Also, if you are using an electronic shutter, In an LED environment, you're also going to see that flickering. Sometimes there's no way you can get around it because the establishment's using it. So if you see that, if you can use mechanical shutter doesn't have the problem. I'll demonstrate it. Let's go back to stills. Mechanical shutter, no problem, right? Silent shutter, turn this on, repeat. Everything's the same, just electronic shutter. There you go. So that is what's happening is electronic shutter will show those artifacts for LED lighting. Let's talk about the multi-function button. It's on the top of the camera, just in front of the primary selector. So when we push the multi-function button, it pulls up a small menu giving us access to a number of different items, including ISO. Then and also we have our different control wheels here. You have our primary indicator and our secondary indicator. And what that's telling us is that we can shift through the different categories by continuing to push on the multi-function button, which is what I'm doing. And then if we want to change something within that, we can just rotate it. So I'm toggling and I'm changing, toggling and changing. And this is going to be really useful when you're looking through the viewfinder, as you're shooting. Is there exposure compensation? We can also use the secondary control wheel to change the categories as well. So we can change it with this. We can do it by pushing the MFN button, and then we change what we want by rotating the primary selector. That's what the MFN button is all about. So we also have this lock button on the top of the camera. The lock switch will lock your exposure settings, joystick, and some other controls. And you can see here, we have our control wheel. When I rotate it, nothing's happening. We can still change our primary selector, right? But the exposure compensation is not changing. Rotate it, it's telling us, hey, this is locked, right? And if I push it again, now we can change it. So what the lock does is it restricts certain controls from being bumped and changing. Here's the joystick, can't change it. And in the deep menu, there's ways to turn off which locks are working and which ones are not.